The word got used once. It appeared in a private conversation between a former senior private secretary and a colleague, years after he had left Charles's household and acquired the distance from it that permitted honest speech. His colleague has described the conversation since, in the careful general terms of someone who understands what they are saying and what it costs. What he had not used was any of the long refined vocabulary that royal household service had developed over centuries for exactly this kind of moment, the vocabulary of difficult, challenging, particular, demanding. The formal register for everything the institution needed to communicate about a principle without quite communicating it. What he had used was a plain English word, short and specific, meaning exactly what it said and requiring no diplomatic management to make it usable. It landed in the room, his colleague recalled later, with the weight of something carried for a long time by someone who had finally found the conditions to set it down. Neither of them was surprised. Neither needed to explain what the word was for. They had both worked close enough to the reality to know. This is the story of what the word was for: the portrait and the painter. Every large institution produces a version of its most important members that serves institutional purposes. The British monarchy has been doing this longer than most organizations currently operating on the planet, and it has refined the production to a level that the professional communications industry has genuine reason to study. The portrait is not fabricated. That would be both morally indefensible and practically ineffective, since fabrications of complete characters from nothing are visible in the way the best counterfeits are visible, through the specific absence of authentic detail that fabrication cannot reproduce. The effective portrait is built on real material, real intellectual interests, real conviction, real achievement, selected and arranged by people who understand that what matters most is not what is shown but what is placed behind the light. Charles had real material. This is important to establish at the beginning, because the failure to establish it produces a simplified account that serves nobody, least of all the purposes of an honest record. He had genuine intellectual curiosity. People who encountered him in unmanaged contexts, who had no institutional reason to produce favorable impressions and nothing at stake in the producing, describe the same experience consistently enough across enough years and settings that the consistency constitutes evidence rather than a collection of polite anecdotes. He could engage with ideas seriously. He read not decoratively, not in the way public figures read for the photographs of them reading, but with the actual investment of attention that reading requires and that shows in the specific quality of the engagement it produces. His position on architecture was not a hobby that had accumulated to prominence. It was a sustained, specific, informed argument about the relationship between the built environment and human well-being that preceded the mainstream version of the same argument by years, and that contained a genuine philosophical foundation that could be disagreed with on its own terms. The environmental work preceded its fashionability. This matters because the later version of Charles, the one the changing climate made easier to celebrate, was built substantially on convictions he had been expressing since the 1970s, when the convictions were not fashionable and were producing coverage that characterized him as eccentric in ways the palace communications apparatus was required to manage with some care. The Prince Trust was real and produced measurable outcomes in measurable numbers of lives across its decades of operation. The organic farm at Highgrove was a serious enterprise before organic farming became a marketing category. The vision was there. The material was there. The portrait was built on it. The portrait selected the material and placed it in a light that served the institutional purpose, and the institutional purpose required that other things remain behind the light, specific things. Things that the staff knew, and that the inner circle managed, and that the communications professionals understood. They were in the business of keeping invisible. The things that, years after the service had ended and the professional dependency had dissolved, produced in a man who had served as his most senior private secretary the specific conditions for the use of a plain English word that royal household vocabulary had been constructed across centuries specifically to avoid. When Charles became King Charles III on September 8, 2022, the official portrait received its final major update. The sensitive, misunderstood prince became the mature and purposeful monarch. The architectural campaigns became prescience. The environmental advocacy became vindication. The years of waiting became wisdom. The communications apparatus pivoted with practiced efficiency to the new frame, as it had pivoted to every preceding frame across the 50 years it had been pivoting. What the new frame omitted was any honest accounting of what the 73 years of formation had installed in the man now wearing the crown. Formation does not dissolve at accession. This is the most important and the least examined fact about King Charles III. The patterns that the household staff described across the years of his public life, the requirements and the rages and the cold register, and the constitutional overreach, and the specific management of anyone who challenged his view, were patterns formed and reinforced across 7 decades of daily practice. They are structural in a man of 73, in the way that only structures built across 7 decades of uninterrupted reinforcement can be structural. The reckoning that the staff carry in their own archives has not yet been fully performed. The burial is not complete. The boy who became the man, understanding what the people around him eventually experienced, requires going back to what formed him. Not for the purpose of producing an excuse, because what is formed in childhood does not become the responsibility of the adults who suffered its expression in someone else's adult life. But the account that stops at the behavior without examining the formation is incomplete. And incomplete accounts serve nobody except the people who benefit from the incompleteness. He was born on November 14, 1948, in the Ballroom at Buckingham Palace. His mother was 22 years old. His father worked squash in another part of the building and was notified of the birth by a footman. This detail has been repeated often enough that its edges have been worn smooth by repetition. The significance survives the wearing if you look at it fresh. The man who would spend the next 4 decades attempting to form his eldest son into a specific kind of person was not present when that son arrived in the world. He was in another room, doing something he preferred. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching. From today, the Queen was 22. She had responsibilities that most 22-year-olds do not face, and the press of those responsibilities was real and belongs in any honest account. But what those responsibilities produced in the earliest years of Charles' life was an absence. Not malicious, not deliberate, the unavoidable product of circumstances that required his parents to be somewhere other than where he was, with enough frequency that his primary attachment figures were not his parents, but the members of staff who were consistently there when his parents were not. His primary attachment figure was his nanny, Mabel Anderson. This is documented by Charles himself, by his authorized biographer Jonathan Dimbleby, and by various accounts of people in the household during those years. He attached to Anderson with the specific intensity of a child who has located the person who is reliably there. When he was sent to school at 8, in the autumn of 1956, the attachment was severed in the way boarding school severs attachments. Abruptly, without management of what the severing costs, he was sent to Cheam School in Hampshire. The school's approach was the approach of an English preparatory school of the period. Cold showers, competitive sport, academic work conducted within a disciplinary structure that assumed discomfort-produced character. In Charles's case, it produced a small, sensitive, persistently homesick boy who wrote letters to his parents describing what was happening and received the kind of replies that his parents, in their genuine care for him, believed would help. His mother told him to keep his chin up. His father told him it would get better. Neither of them came to take him home. He stayed at Cheam for 4 years. He was, by his own later account, unhappy throughout. Not with the dramatic intensity of the first weeks, but with the lower-level persistent unhappiness of a child who has concluded that the people with the authority to change his situation have decided not to. He was the heir to the throne, which meant the other boys knew who he was, and knowing who he was gave them a specific social resource. that boys of that age use with the particular, creative cruelty that boarding school environments produce. His father decided on Gordonstown for his secondary education. Philip had attended Gordonstown and had been formed by it in the ways he had wished to be formed. He applied the logic that a formation that had worked for him would work for his son, without accommodating the modification that makes the logic accurate. His son was not him. Philip arrived at Gordonstown as a displaced European prince, with no country and no family, and a demonstrated capacity for physical resilience. Charles arrived as the heir to the British throne, with a temperament that the school's philosophy was specifically designed to address, and that the addressing damaged rather than improved. The bullying at Gordonstown has been documented in considerable detail across multiple accounts, including Charles's own. Boys who attended the school with him have confirmed what happened: the dormitory assaults, the mocking, the targeting of any boy who showed friendship openly. Charles named the experience himself. He called it Colditz in kilts. He told his authorized biographer in the 1990s that he had survived it, but only barely. He has continued referencing it in his 70s, which tells you something about what the survival cost. His father's response to the letters from Gordonstown was the same as to the letters from Cheam. Had decided. The family would not be changing its mind. He must keep going. He must stop showing the need. He stopped showing the need. He learned to stop in the way children learn things, when the learning is the price of survival. The need did not disappear. It relocated from the surface of his behavior to somewhere underneath it, where it continued to operate without being visible, shaping everything the way underground water shapes the terrain above it, without being seen. The dismissal of his detective, Donald Green, in 1963 is one of the most revealing details of those years. Charles had ordered a cherry brandy at a hotel in Stornoway during a school sailing trip. A journalist witnessed it. The story reached the press. The palace was embarrassed. Green, who had been the most significant adult presence in Charles's school years and the one adult at Gordonstown who had shown him consistent, unrequited kindness, was fired. The lesson arrived with precision and stayed permanently. Kindness to him was punishable. The cost of genuine connection with him was paid by the person who paid it, not by him. He would carry this understanding through the rest of his life in ways that shaped his relationships with staff, with employees, with the people who served him, in ways that the people who served him later described with the consistency that establishes pattern, rather than a collection of isolated events. This is where the formation of the thing the word was eventually began. Not in a single incident, but in the accumulated daily installation of a specific understanding about how the world was organized and what the people in it were for. The installation was thorough, and it was early, and it proceeded without interruption through the years that produced the assumptions people carry for the rest of their lives. What the Gordonstown years produced, in addition to the specific documented suffering, was a set of adaptations. When you cannot leave an environment and cannot change it, you learn to function within it. You learn the rules that govern what makes the environment tolerable, and you learn them at such depth that the learning stops being visible as learning and becomes simply the way you operate. Charles learned to manage. He learned to present a functional surface to the environment that was requiring the function from him. He learned to separate what he felt from what he showed, to contain what the environment had no use for, to produce whatever the environment required while keeping everything else behind it. He learned this so thoroughly that the learning became him. The distinction between the surface and what was underneath it stopped being a strategy and became a structure. And the structure, once installed, applied everywhere, not just at school, but in every subsequent environment in which he was required to function, including the environments where the people in them were not trying to bully him, including the environments where the people in them were trying to help him. The structure applied because structures do not distinguish between the environments that required them and the environments that do not. They simply operate. He left Gordonstown in 1967 at 18. He went to Trinity College, Cambridge. He read archaeology and anthropology, then history. He was, by accounts of those who taught him, an engaged and intellectually curious student who found in the university environment something Gordonstoun had not provided, a context in which his sensitivity was a social asset rather than a target. He made friends. He discovered theater. He encountered for the first time an adult world in which the things he valued were valued by others. The Cambridge years are significant for something other than their academic content. They were the years in which Charles, for the first time in his life, spent an extended period in an environment that was not designed to produce misery in him. He flourished in that environment with the specific quality of flowering that happens when a plant is finally given the soil conditions it requires. People who knew him during this period have described a version of Charles that was more open, more engaged, more present than the version they encountered in later years when the institutional weight had returned. The Cambridge version was not the final version. The institutional weight returned with force after Cambridge. But the Cambridge version is evidence of what the formation had covered. Rather than removed, he also met at a party in 1971 a woman named Camilla Shand. She was 23. She was attractive, forthright, physically confident, completely unawed by him in the specific way that made her different from almost everyone else in his life. What matters for this account is not the romantic detail, but the structural fact. He found in Camilla Shand someone who treated him as a person rather than as a position, and the experience was sufficiently unusual in his life that it produced in him something close to dependence. The young man and the calculation he joined the Royal Navy in 1971. He served with the specific competence that Navy reports reflect, flew helicopters, commanded a minesweeper HMS Bronington from 1976 to 1977. The men who served under him have generally spoken of him with the warmth of people who found him more human in that environment than his public image suggested. The Navy gave him a professional identity defined by function rather than by birth, a context in which the hierarchy operated through the work being done together rather than through the weight of his position. He appears to have been happier in it than almost anywhere else. While he was at sea, Camilla Shand married Andrew Parker Bowles, July 1973. He was not present for the decision. He had not been in a position to make an alternative offer, partly because of the Navy, and partly because his family had made clear that she was not a suitable permanent partner for the heir to the throne. The grounds for unsuitability varied depending on who in the family was explaining them, but the consistent element was that she did not meet the specific requirements a prospective queen consort was expected to meet. He accepted the family's position. He lost her to the acceptance. He spent the next several years in relationships with women who found him interesting for the position, not for the person, and who could not provide what Camilla had provided. The treatment of him as someone ordinary. The relationships were unhappy with the consistency that people close to him during this period described in later accounts with sad recognition. Anna Wallace came closest to something more serious in 1979 and 1980. She ended the relationship after Charles spent a significant portion of a ball in the company of Camilla Parker Bowles, while Wallace stood to the side. She told him that night that no one, including the Prince of Wales, treated her that way. She left. People who were present described the scene with the discomfort of witnesses to something simultaneously embarrassing and illuminating. He had been in the same room as Camilla and had not adequately registered the person he was supposed to be attending to. This was a pattern. The people who observed it described it as one. He was 31 when his family settled on Diana Spencer as the suitable candidate. The marriage and what the household saw, Lady Diana Spencer was 19 when Charles's attentions became serious. She was the daughter of the 8th Earl Spencer, whose family had served the royal household in various capacities for generations. She had, in the language the people around Charles used to assess these matters, the right connections and the right history. She was also, by every account from people who knew her at the time, entirely unprepared for what she was entering. Not because she was unintelligent. She was perceptive in specific ways that the subsequent years would demonstrate at considerable cost to the institution she had joined. But no 19-year-old who had attended a finishing school in Switzerland and worked briefly as a nursery assistant was equipped for the specific and total demands of senior royal life. She did not know what the system required. She did not know it was not a system designed to accommodate her needs. Philip's letter to Charles in 1981 has been documented across multiple biographies. It said Charles needed to commit to Diana or release her, that keeping her in public suspension while he made up his mind was damaging to her reputation and was not something the family was prepared to tolerate. The letter indicated the direction the family's preference pointed. Charles wrote back. The written exchange was later characterized by both Charles and Diana as the correspondence that produced the engagement. A former lady-in-waiting who served the Princess of Wales during the later 1980s described the texture from the specific proximity of her role with the particular economy of someone who has had considerable time to know what her experience contained and who has decided the knowing deserves to be said. She said the thing that the public version of the Wales marriage consistently failed to convey was how quickly it had settled into its final shape. The public kept expecting a marriage in the process of becoming something, a relationship that might yet resolve in the direction of what had been publicly promised. The peoples inside the household had understood within a relatively short time that it had already resolved, and into something quite different from what had been promised. She said Charles's behavior in those years was something she had spent considerable time constructing frames for, and that none of the frames had fully satisfied her. He knew what Diana was carrying. The household was small enough, and the patterns of daily life intimate enough that not knowing was not an available position. His management of his own schedule, his own priorities, his own requirements in this context, with this knowledge, was something she had looked at from many angles. She said that on one occasion she had witnessed a moment of what she could only describe as genuine warmth between them, a moment when something natural had surfaced between the two of them and was visible from outside it and real. She said the moment was more painful to witness than the difficult ones, not less, because the moment demonstrated what was there and available and consistently chose to be somewhere else. A former press aide who worked within the household during the early 1990s described the experience from a different angle. He said his primary professional function was the management of the boundary between what the inside of the household knew and what the outside world was told. He said the job required a specific kind of daily recalibration because the gap between the two things was not static. It widened over time as the inside knowledge accumulated, and the outside management required more resource to contain it. He said he was good at the job. He said the job had a specific daily satisfaction that he did not find dishonest at the time, but that he has found it harder to characterize as anything other than dishonest since. He said he worked until the Morton book made the work impossible in its previous form. He said the surprise about the Morton book among the people inside the household was not that it had happened. The surprise was that it had taken as long as it had. He also described an afternoon during which Diana had been in some form of distress elsewhere in the building, and Charles had been in another room and had been informed of the situation and had asked for more tea. He said he had written that afternoon in his diary, not the distress, not the specific circumstances, just the tea. He said he was not entirely sure why he had written it down, except that it seemed at the time like the detail that most accurately conveyed something he did not have the larger language for. He said he understood later what the language for it was. He said the language was the plain kind, the kind you reach for when the formal vocabulary has been carrying a weight it was not designed for, and you have finally found the conditions to set the weight down. A former member of Charles's personal staff described a different quality of the same pattern from a different vantage point within the household. She said the specific thing about working in that household during that period was not any single incident. It was the texture of the working day across time. She said the texture was characterized by a particular kind of compartmentalization that she had. initially understood as a professional adaptation, a way of maintaining function during a period when the personal circumstances were such that function required active maintenance. She said it took her several years to understand that the compartmentalization was not an adaptation to difficulty. It was the baseline. It was how Charles related to the daily reality of the people around him, regardless of whether the circumstances were ordinary or difficult. The personal circumstances of the people in his household, including the most intimate personal circumstances of the person who shared his household in the role of his wife, were information that sat in a different mental register from the information he was processing as he went through his day. The request for more tea was not a failure of feeling. She thought for a long time that it might be that. She came to think instead that it was the accurate expression of a structure that had been in place long before Diana, and that would have been in place with any person in any version of his life. She said the distinction mattered to her because the version where it was a failure of feeling toward Diana specifically left room for a counterfactual. The version where it was the structure of how he engaged with the emotional reality of the people around him in general did not leave the same room. She said she found the second version harder to look at. She also said she found it more accurate. Before diving deeper on that, consider subscribing to our channel and pushing the bell icon so you never miss an update. If you like this documentary, please consider subscribing. The requirements is a specific vocabulary that former members of Charles's household used when discussing their employment, developed over years of professional processing of their experience and available in the private conversations that happen when the formal accountability has dissolved, not the vocabulary of crisis, the vocabulary of precision, the vocabulary of people who worked in an environment defined by requirements and who are describing the requirements with the accuracy of people for whom accuracy was the primary professional discipline. The requirements were extensive and they were specific and they were non-negotiable in a way that the word non-negotiable generally softens, but in this context accurately describes. The bath water. The temperature was a precise requirement. Not warm, not hot. A specific temperature confirmed by a thermometer by the member of staff responsible for the bath before Charles entered the bathroom. Former household members from multiple periods and multiple residences have confirmed this requirement independently. The confirmation across sources is what distinguishes it from the category of royal folklore that accumulates around any sufficiently prominent figure. This is not folklore. This is documented experience. The toothpaste, the specific amount, and the specific application to the brush. Not squeezed by Charles, ready when he arrived, the amount was not approximate. The former valet, who described it in one of the most widely read accounts of Charles's private requirements, said the description made him sound absurd, and that the absurdity was not inaccurate but was also not the main thing. The main thing was that it was the environment, and the environment had a texture, and the texture accumulated across every minute of the working day into something that was its own experience. The boiled eggs. Several former members of his Highgrove household have described, in different accounts at different times, and in different publications, the practice of preparing multiple boiled eggs cooked to different degrees of doneness to be presented, so that Charles could select the one that most closely matched his preference that morning. The practice has been confirmed by enough independent sources to constitute documented fact. The eggs were prepared, they were presented, he selected. The ones not selected were disposed of. The preparation was not performed alongside the staff members' other duties. It was their duty. The hotel rooms. His practice when traveling, which was frequently, was to bring his specific requirements in a form that hotels received advance notice of and were expected to accommodate. The list included room temperature, particular furniture arrangements, specific items to be present and specific items to be absent. The preparation of rooms for his arrival was, by the accounts of hotel staff at various establishments that hosted him across his years as Prince of Wales, an operation of significant complexity that required advance work measured in days, not hours. a hotel manager at a major European establishment, described the preparation for a Charles visit with the resigned specificity of someone who had done a thing enough times to find the description effortless. The advance team arrived 2 days prior. The list was specific enough that the hotel's standard level of preparation, which was the highest the hotel offered, was insufficient. Additional preparation was required. This included the replacement of a painting in the main bedroom, because Charles had seen it on a previous visit and had indicated a preference for a different one. The alternative was hung. When he departed, the original was restored. The manager said this was not unusual. He said the unusual thing would have been a visit that did not require it. A former member of staff, who worked at Highgrove for several years, described what the requirement texture felt like as an overall working environment. She said the defining feature was not any individual requirement, which could be learned and managed. It was the atmosphere the requirements collectively created. The understanding that penetrated every aspect of the working day that the standard was. Everything that the standard was his to define and the staff's to meet. And that the meeting was expected and the failure was unacceptable. And that the expectation and the unacceptability were not balanced by any corresponding acknowledgement of the meeting when it happened correctly. She said the silence was the loudest thing. The correct bath temperature produced nothing. The correctly prepared toothpaste produced nothing. The room at the right temperature with the right arrangement produced nothing. Success was invisible. Failure was not. The asymmetry, maintained across every hour of every working day, was the texture of what it meant to serve him. She said she thought about the asymmetry for years after she left. She thought about it in the way you think about something that clarified something you had not previously understood about how some people experience the world. The asymmetry was not merely a feature of working for Charles. It was how he understood the relationship between himself and the people who served him. The service was expected. The meeting of the expectation was the baseline. The baseline did not earn acknowledgement because meeting the baseline was not an achievement. It was simply the execution of the function for which the person had been engaged. The person was a function. The function meeting its specification was unremarkable. The function filling its specification required attention. This was how he related to the people whose professional lives were organized around the maintenance of his physical environment. It is recorded by enough independent sources across enough different periods and residences and categories of role that characterizing it as a pattern is what the evidence requires. Another former staff member who worked in a different capacity and at a different residence during a different period described an element of the requirements culture that other accounts had not fully addressed. He said the requirements were not merely extensive, they were continuous in their growth. The requirements at the end of his tenure were more extensive than the requirements at the beginning of his tenure. Not dramatically more, not in any single large expansion that could be identified as a change in the arrangement. Incrementally more. Each small addition normalized and incorporated until the incorporation made it part of the baseline, which then provided the floor from which the next small addition could be made. He said this was the thing that he found most difficult to explain to people who had not worked within the environment. The sense of a standard that was always in the process of becoming slightly more demanding than it had been, not because the requirements were capriciously changed, but because the requirements expressed a person's relationship to their environment, and that relationship was one in which the environment was always under assessment for whether it was meeting the requirements he had not yet articulated as well as the ones he had. The requirements that had not yet been articulated were the ones you became aware of by failing to meet them. The failure to meet them was the discovery. The discovery was the new requirement. He said the staff learned to operate proactively in this environment, to anticipate the requirements that had not yet been articulated by developing increasingly detailed models of the preferences and standards they had so far encountered. The modeling was extensive. It was the primary cognitive activity of the working day. He said it was also from a pure problem-solving perspective, genuinely interesting work, and that the interest in the problem-solving was one of the ways the environment retained people who might otherwise have concluded earlier than they did that the environment was not one they wished to remain in. The rages. The rages were different from the requirements in specific ways, and the differences matter for an accurate account. The requirements were constant, structural, baked into the daily reality of serving him in a way that was predictable and could be managed through training and sustained attention. The rages were not constant. They were not predictable in their timing. They arrived without reliable warning from triggers that bore no reliable relationship to their intensity, and the specific quality of them was different from the quality of the requirements. Former staff members describing them used specific words: not difficult, not frustrated, not upset, rage. The word appears across accounts from people who served in different capacities and different periods with a consistency that removes the charitable interpretation that any single witness was exaggerating. A former equerry who served in the late 1980s described an incident involving a pen. The pen did not write. It had been placed on a signing table for an official function and did not produce ink when Charles attempted to use it. What followed lasted approximately 4 minutes. The equerry described it in the specific terms of someone who has replayed the memory often and has chosen each word with care. He said Charles threw the pen. He said the throwing was not the throwing of someone releasing frustration with a gesture and moving on. It was the throwing of someone communicating through a physical act, the full weight of their displeasure in a way directed at the people in the room as much as at the object. He said the language that accompanied it was extensive and specific. It covered the pen and the table and the system that had allowed a non-functioning punctum to be placed within his reach, and the general failure of the people around him to maintain the standard his requirements demanded. After 4 minutes it ended. Charles moved on. He continued with the function. He engaged with the next item on the agenda with the complete ordinariness of someone for whom the preceding 4 minutes had not occurred. He did not acknowledge what had happened. He did not acknowledge the people who had been in the room for it. The function continued. The signed documents were signed with a different pen, produced from the equerry's own pocket. The equerry said the second pen from his pocket was the part that stayed with him. He had learned by that point to carry a backup. The learning had required an earlier incident he did not elaborate on. The backup pen was the institutional response, the personal adaptation of a professional who had absorbed the pattern and incorporated its management into his own practice. Staff carried backup pens. They tested bath temperatures twice. They arranged desk objects with the precision of people who understood what the incorrect arrangement produced. They developed the specific professional caution of people who have learned that their environment is one where any small failure produces a consequence disproportionate to its scale, and where the gap between the failure and the consequence is not something they had any power to close. A former member of the Highgrove household described an incident in the garden. Charles had been inspecting a section of planting with his head gardener. An area had not progressed as the plans had indicated. The gap between the actual state of the planting and the intended state was, by any reasonable horticultural assessment, within the normal range of variation that seasonal conditions produce. It was not a failure of husbandry. It was the expected outcome of conditions the head gardener had explained in advance could produce variability. Charles looked at the planting for a long time without speaking. The head gardener described the quality of the looking with the language of someone who had been looked at in that way before and who knew what the looking contained. Charles then turned and walked away without speaking. The not speaking was not neutral. It was the specific form of the cold register that the household had learned to read as its own category of event. The focused silent attention to failure that communicated everything the louder version communicated, and that was harder to respond to because there was nothing to respond to. Only the awareness of having been assessed and found insufficient and left with that assessment while its source walked away. Multiple staff members from multiple periods described the cold register and the hot register as distinct experiences sharing the common feature of a complete absence of proportionality. The hot version was loud. Objects were sometimes involved. The language was specific and sometimes personal. It lasted a defined period and then ended with the completeness the equerry described. The cold version was quiet. It was focused. It communicated through the specific quality of attention rather than through noise. Several staff described the cold register as the more difficult of the two to absorb because the hot version had a clear shape with a beginning and an end, while the cold version lingered in a way that made its conclusion less legible. A former senior private secretary described the experience from a more senior position than the equerry and the household staff. He said that even from his position, the cold register was a professional experience unlike anything he had encountered in any other working environment. It was disorienting in the specific way that the sudden suspension of normal social accountability is always disorienting, because the register operated as though the ordinary rules of professional exchange had been temporarily suspended and replaced by rules that the person at the center of the exchange defined unilaterally. He could not respond. He could not explain. He could not point to the facts that contradicted the assessment being communicated. He could only absorb. He said he had spent considerable time thinking about the specific mechanism that produced that kind of interaction and had concluded that the mechanism was not primarily about anger in the ordinary sense. It was about something more structural than anger, something installed at such depth that it was invisible from the inside. This was the former senior private secretary, the one who many years later, in a private conversation with a colleague, both of them passed the point where the formal vocabulary was adequate or honest, used a plain English word. The word that required no diplomatic management, that meant exactly what it said, and that described with precision what the cold register and the hot register and the backup pens at ambient temperature and the 2 days of advanced preparation and the rehung paintings and the silence after the correct bath all together were. The colleague understood immediately. Neither of them needed to elaborate. They had both worked close enough to the reality. The letters and the constitutional questions. The Black Spider memos became part of the public record in May 2015, after a legal battle that ran for 10 years, produced a Supreme Court judgment, and required the Attorney General to make the specific argument that their release would undermine the political neutrality of the monarchy. The argument was accurate about the effect. The release confirmed exactly what the Attorney General had argued it would confirm. The letters demonstrated that the Prince of Wales had been writing to government ministers, senior civil servants, and the heads of public institutions across multiple decades, advocating in specific and detailed terms for specific policy positions on matters that were unambiguously within the constitutional domain of elected government. The subjects covered by the disclosed letters included the staffing and deployment of British military forces in Afghanistan, about which Charles had written with the familiarity of someone who considered his military opinions relevant to decisions being made by the Ministry of Defense. They included the planning decisions of NHS hospital trusts. They included farming policy, fishing policy, the regulation of natural medicine, and multiple subjects relating to the built environment. The letter about Chelsea Barracks requires its own paragraph. In 2009, Prince Charles wrote directly to the Qatari Prime Minister, whose sovereign wealth fund was the developer of a proposed residential scheme on the site of the former Chelsea Barracks in central London. The architectural firm Rogers Stirk Harbour and Partners had won the commission through a competitive process. Charles objected to the design. He communicated his objection through the most direct route available to him: a personal letter to the head of government whose country was the scheme's primary investor. The Rogers firm was withdrawn from the project. The architects had no recourse. They were a firm that had won a commission through appropriate professional processes and had had the commission ended through a communication between two people whose connection to the project operated entirely outside those processes. There was no mechanism for challenging the outcome because the outcome had been produced by a power relationship that the legal and professional frameworks governing architecture simply were not built to address. The Hampton Court speech of 1984 had the same structure. The architects, whose National Gallery extension Charles characterized as a monstrous carbuncle on the face of a much-loved and elegant friend, could not respond at the scale of the characterization because they did not have access to a comparable platform. The characterization entered the culture and stayed there. Their work, produced through a legitimate competitive process, was ended by a phrase from a man whose access to the platform that phrase required had nothing to do with his qualifications to deliver the judgment. A former architect who worked on a public project in the early 1990s that received a characterization from Charles in a public speech described the specific professional injury. He said the injury was not merely reputational, it was structural. You could not sue the Prince of Wales for expressing an aesthetic opinion. You could not file a formal complaint through any process with the institutional standing to require a response. You could not respond at scale. You could write to newspapers and see your letters published in the professional press, where they were read by people who already had views. And that did not materially change the public conversation. The architectural profession had over time, he said, developed a collective practice of not engaging with Charles's interventions in ways that would draw further attention to them. The option of ignoring him was not available because he had the platform to make his views impossible to ignore. The option of engaging was professionally risky because engaging required treating the intervention as a matter of legitimate architectural debate when it had arrived through channels that had nothing to do with legitimate debate. The civil servants who received his letters about military deployment were in an equivalent position. They could not ignore a letter from the Prince of Wales. They could not respond with the directness they would have brought to correspondence from any other source. They managed it with the careful professional language of people who have been given an impossible brief. How to respond in a way that is not dishonest about the constitutional problem, while not producing a response that could be characterized as disrespectful to the heir to the throne. Most chose the managed acknowledgement, a response that noted the prince's concerns, expressed engagement with the issues raised, and did not promise what the constitutional framework did not permit him to be promised. The letters were filed and proceeded no further in their intended direction. Some appear to have had effects. The question of which effects and through what mechanism is one that the full archival record, even after the 2015 disclosure, has not settled. The homeopathy campaign is the most revealing illustration of the conviction quality, because homeopathy is not a matter of aesthetic preference in the way that architecture can be characterized as such. It is a matter of evidence. What the research record shows about the efficacy of homeopathy is not ambiguous and has not been ambiguous for a long time. It is not a controversial characterization to note that the systematic reviews have reached consistent conclusions across multiple countries and research traditions. Charles disagreed, not in the way that someone disagrees with a scientific consensus when they have engaged with the evidence and found it unpersuasive for specific reasons they can articulate. He disagreed in the way that someone disagrees with a consensus when it conflicts with something they believe, and the belief is more deeply rooted than the consensus is capable of reaching. He wrote to the Chief Medical Officer, to the Department of Health, to the heads of NHS trusts, advocating for the inclusion of homeopathic treatments in NHS services and against decisions by NHS bodies that had concluded on the basis of the evidence that homeopathic treatments should not receive public funding. The people who received these letters had no good options. Agreeing would have been scientifically indefensible. Disagreeing clearly would have required telling the heir to the throne, in writing, that his judgment was wrong. Most of them found the middle path that the middle path always offers to people in impossible positions. Acknowledgement without agreement, engagement without concession, he continued. The letters continued. The advocacy continued. The conviction was not addressed by the evidence because it was not formed by the evidence and was not susceptible to revision by it. The conviction was formed by something older and more durable than evidence. It was formed by the specific quality of certainty that a formation installs when the formation tells you, from your earliest years, that your views are important, that the world should attend to them, and that the people around you are there to support the expression of them. There is a quality that is common to the homeopathy letters and the Afghanistan deployment letters and the Hampton Court speech and the Chelsea Barracks letter, a quality that makes it accurate to treat them not as a collection of separate interventions in separate domains, but as expressions of a single underlying assumption. The assumption is that his judgment is relevant, not that his judgment is correct, though the assumption of correctness is also present. More fundamentally than that, the assumption that the domain of his relevance is unlimited, that there is no area of policy or professional practice or public life to which his view is not a contribution that the people operating in that area are required to receive and to respond to and to manage. This assumption was not arrived at in adulthood. It was not the product of his specific adult experience of being taken seriously. It was installed in the formation and expressed through the formation in every area where the formation found occasion for expression. Architecture was an occasion. Military deployment was an occasion. Homeopathy was an occasion. The occasions were not the cause. The formation was the cause. The occasions were simply the available expression of it. The people who received the letters understood this. The senior civil servants, the ministers, the medical officers, and the planning officials and the architects, none of them received these letters without understanding what they were receiving. They received a communication from the heir to the throne, whose constitutional position prohibited the communication. They responded with the vocabulary developed for exactly this situation. The formal register for everything the institution needed to communicate about a principle, without quite communicating it. They acknowledged, they engaged, they did not concede, they managed. They were, in other words, doing something structurally identical to what his staff was doing about the bath temperature and the eggs and the furniture arrangements. They were maintaining the baseline. They were meeting the specification. They were doing it without acknowledgement and without an account of what they were doing that accurately described the nature of the transaction. The vocabulary protected them as it protected the staff. The vocabulary was not dishonest about the facts. It was dishonest about their nature. The Highgrove Project Highgrove House in Gloucestershire became Charles's country residence in 1980 when he purchased it with funds from the Duchy of Cornwall. The house itself, a relatively modest Georgian country house by the standards of large English country estates, was not what defined the Highgrove experience for the people who worked there. The garden was what defined it. The Highgrove Garden, across 4 decades of Charles's occupation, became one of the most discussed private gardens in Britain. Its evolution from a conventional country house garden into the walled and formal and wildflower and kitchen and stumpery assemblage that it became was documented, photographed, written about, and visited by a large public who paid for the privilege of the tour. The garden was a genuine artistic achievement in the sense that it reflected a coherent vision sustained over decades, with the commitment that a coherent vision requires. It was also the most demanding professional environment that any member of the staff associated with it had encountered. The head gardener role at Highgrove was one of the most specific and demanding positions in British horticulture. The person who occupied it was required to maintain and develop a garden to a standard of exactness that Charles defined and that Charles assessed, with the personal involvement of someone for whom the garden was not a feature of a residence, but an expression of a life. He spent time in it daily when he was at Highgrove. He knew every plant in it. He had opinions, developed and specific opinions, about every section of it. He communicated those opinions through annotated instructions to the head gardener, written in the particular sprawling handwriting that had become known from the political correspondence, and that conveyed through its sprawl the pace, at which Charles produced thoughts about things he cared about. The head gardeners who served him across the decades have described the experience with the mixture of professional respect for what was being attempted and professional honesty about what was being worked within. They respected the vision. They found the working of it requiring personal adaptations that most horticultural careers do not prepare you for. A former senior gardener who worked at Highgrove during the 1990s described the specific culture of the kitchen garden section, which was Charles's most actively managed interest within the broader estate, and which produced the organic vegetables the household used. She said the kitchen garden was maintained to a standard that went beyond the demands of organic horticulture. It was maintained to a standard set by the aesthetic requirement as much as the agricultural one. The rows had to be straight in ways that the organic approach to growing, which accepts a degree of natural variation as part of its operating philosophy, did not always naturally produce. The presentation of the kitchen garden was as important as its productivity, and the two requirements were not always compatible. She said the resolution of the incompatibility was always in favor of the presentation. When the presentation requirement and any other requirement were in conflict, the presentation won. The presentation was Charles's primary requirement, and it was Charles's requirement that set the priorities. She also described the specific culture of corrections in the garden environment. In the garden, the cold register was more common than the hot one, possibly because the garden was a space Charles associated with a particular kind of reflective calm that the house did not always produce. But the cold register in a garden context carried its own specific weight because the garden was a space you could not leave without it being visible that you had left. You were in it, and the correction arrived, and you had nowhere to go while it was happening except further into the garden, which sometimes meant further into the inspection. She said she learned to receive corrections in the garden with the specific physical posture of someone who has learned how to occupy the space of being corrected without the occupation being visible as discomfort. She said the learning took approximately 2 growing seasons. The Highgrove organic farm operation, which ran alongside the garden and was in the later decades commercially operated through the Duchy Originals brand and its successor Waitrose Duchy. Organic was a more complex enterprise than the garden in its staffing and operation. Former farm staff described an environment that had many of the characteristics of the household environment, but with the additional complexity of operating as a commercial business within the broader charitable and duchy infrastructure. A former operations manager at the Highgrove farm described the specific experience of managing the commercial dimension of the operation against the requirements of the residential and horticultural dimension. He said the two dimensions had different priorities and that the resolution of conflicts between those priorities was consistently in favor of the residential and horticultural dimension, which was Charles's primary frame of reference for what the farm was for. A commercial farm operation consistently required to resolve its conflicts in favor of a residential aesthetic is not operating on the terms that commercial operations require to be sustainable. He said the commercial operation was sustainable for as long as it was because the duchy income provided a support structure that a purely commercial organic farm of the same scale would not have had access to. He said the specific professional challenge of working within that structure was the challenge of being accountable to two masters, the commercial market and the residential aesthetic, with the hierarchy between them non-negotiably in favor of the one that was less commercially relevant but more personally important to the person who defined both of them. He left after several years. He said the leaving was connected to a specific incident in which a commercial decision he had made was overridden by a residential aesthetic decision in a way that made clear to him that his professional judgment in the commercial domain was not, in the framework he was operating within, the kind of professional judgment the framework was designed to respect. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Duchy, the Money, and Michael Fawcett, the Duchy of Cornwall, is a property portfolio whose history runs from 1337, when Edward III created it to provide an income for the heir apparent. Its modern configuration includes approximately 135,000 acres spread across 23 counties. When Charles held it as Prince of Wales, the annual income it generated rose from around £3 million in the early years to figures that by the later decades exceeded £20 million annually. The income was not taxed in the way that the income of an ordinary wealthy individual would be taxed. Charles paid income tax on it voluntarily, on the basis of an arrangement with the government that was not statutory but conventional. The voluntariness was the arrangement's most revealing feature. He chose to pay tax in the way that someone eating in a restaurant chooses to leave a tip. The choice was praised in the coverage of it as evidence of public spiritedness. The structural reality behind the choice was something the coverage generally declined to examine. The duchy income funded a household that was large. When the full staff across his residences, his private offices, his charitable operation, and his public functions were accounted for, Charles employed hundreds of people. The support structure of his daily existence was substantial in ways that isolated public glimpses of it could not fully convey. A former member of the household accounts teams described the experience of working within the budget structure with the specific precision of someone whose professional function had given her direct access to the numbers. She said the scale was the first thing. The numbers involved in the daily operation, the staffing costs, the maintenance costs, the travel arrangements, the catering requirements for the formal entertaining that was a regular feature of the household's operation. All of these accumulated to an annual cost that was, by any ordinary measure, very large. She said the second thing was the unquestioned quality of the expenditure, not wasteful in any obvious sense, not the spending of someone throwing money at unnecessary things for the pleasure of throwing it, spending at a level, and in a register that assumed at every point that the standard required was whatever standard Charles had determined it should be. A standard arrived at through no process of consideration about what was reasonable or proportionate or justifiable in relation to the public and private resources funding it. He had never been required to consider what was reasonable because the resources had always been sufficient to meet whatever he required, and no one in his environment had ever found it their role to suggest that the standard might be reconsidered. Michael Fawcett's career in and around Charles's household is the most extensively documented illustration of how the household's hierarchy of values operated. Fawcett started as a junior footman. He became, across the years of his service to Charles, first his principal personal valet, then his most trusted personal aide, then the person who organized his personal life in its most intimate dimensions. He traveled with Charles. He arranged the specifics of hotel stays. He was responsible for the personal preparation of Charles's physical environment when Charles was away. From his residences, he was, by the accounts of senior household members who worked alongside him, indispensable to Charles in a way that was unprecedented in the formal hierarchy. Fawcett resigned from royal service in 1990 after allegations of bullying toward junior staff. He was rehired. He left official royal employment in 2003 after a Commons Select Committee inquiry was told that he had engaged in selling gifts received by Charles to third parties, a practice that raised questions about what the formal rules governing the handling of royal gifts actually were. He returned to work for Charles through the charitable foundation structure. He resigned again in 2021, following reporting that he had written a letter supporting the award of an honor to a Saudi businessman who had donated to Charles's charitable interests. The story of Fawcett's career is a story about what proximity to the center of that household enabled. It is also a story about what Charles's management of the household permitted. Fawcett was rehired after the 1990 bullying allegations. He returned after 2003. The pattern of re-engagement after conduct that in other employment contexts would have produced permanent separation tells you something about the priorities of the center. What it tells you is that utility displaced almost everything else. Fawcett was useful in the most intimate dimensions of Charles's personal environment. His utility was irreplaceable in the specific sense that replacing him required training someone in requirements that could not be learned from a document. The utility was more important than the conduct. The conduct was managed. The utility was retained. Staff who observed the Fawcett relationship described it with the discomfort of people who understood what it represented about the household's real hierarchy of values. One described the awareness among other household members that the normal accountability mechanisms, the formal channels through which staff concerns were supposed to be processed, operated differently in Fawcett's case. Not differently in the sense that the formal rules were openly suspended. Differently in the sense that the informal weight of his position within the household's real hierarchy made the formal mechanisms less functional than they were in theory. She stayed for several years and then left. She said the leaving was the result of a series of small specific adjustments until the accumulated adjustment had produced a working environment that no longer matched the one she had understood she was joining. Now, if you've made it this far, you're clearly enjoying the story. Like and subscribe to make sure you don't miss future documentaries just like this one. It means the world to us. The rehabilitation and the Camilla years. He married Camilla Parker Bowles on April 9, 2005, in a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall. They had been in a relationship in various forms and with various interruptions since 1971. The 34 years between the first significant meeting and the legal formalization contains most of the important story of both their lives and all of the important story of Diana Spencer's adult life. The rehabilitation of Camilla Parker Bowles as a public figure is one of the more accomplished, long-form communications operations in recent British royal history. She had been received, in the early years of her public visibility, with a hostility calibrated directly to the public's love for Diana. The rehabilitation began in earnest in the years after Diana's death. It was patient and it required patience because the hostility was real and had roots that ran deep. The operation proceeded through managed public appearances, through the gradual normalization of Camilla's presence at events alongside Charles, through the cultivation of the specific press relationships that had always been the palace communications apparatus's primary instrument. What the rehabilitation did not involve was any full accounting of the texture of the Camilla relationship during the years of Charles's marriage to Diana. The Morton book had provided Diana's account. The Dimbleby biography had provided Charles's, including his acknowledgement that the relationship with Camilla had resumed at some point after the early years of the marriage. What neither account fully conveys, and what the staff who were present during those years carried in their own archives, was the daily texture of what it looked like from inside the household. A former member of the Kensington Palace household during the mid-1980s described the texture with the specific economy of someone who has been carrying the knowledge for a long time and who has reached the distance necessary to describe it without the emotional weight that proximity would have carried. He said the thing that the public version consistently missed was not the fact of the Camilla relationship. By the mid-1980s, the fact was not a secret inside the household. The thing it missed was the ordinariness with which the fact was accommodated. It was not a hidden thing in the sense of being carefully concealed from everyone nearby. It was a thing managed at the boundary between the household and the outside world, with considerable professional skill, while inside the household it occupied the status of a known fact that was not discussed in any forum where the discussion could be recorded or transmitted. He said the staff who worked within Charles's immediate circle were not naive. They were professionals with direct access to the scheduling, the correspondence, the patterns of movement and communication that constituted the daily reality of his life. They knew what the patterns told them. They managed the boundary between what they knew and what the outside world was being told with the professional silence their employment required. The silence was not costless. He said the sustained double consciousness of knowing one thing and being professionally required to represent another was a feature of the working environment that had a daily texture he found difficult to convey to anyone who had not experienced a comparable, professional situation. The former lady-in-waiting who served the Princess of Wales described a different dimension. She said Diana's knowledge was complete by the later period, in the sense that it had been complete for some time. There was a period early in the marriage, when Diana had been building her understanding piece by piece. By the later period, the building was done, and the complete picture was simply the picture she lived inside. What changed as the understanding became complete was not Diana's distress, which was real throughout, but its specific character. The early distress had a quality of hoping to be wrong. The later distress was the weight of someone who had stopped resisting the conclusion and was living inside it permanently. She said Charles's behavior in this period was something she had constructed various frames for understanding over the years, and that none of the frames had fully satisfied her. He knew what Diana was carrying. The idea of not knowing was not available to him. His management of his own day, his own requirements, his own priorities in this context, was something she had looked at from many angles, without finding the frame that made it make sense in terms she was comfortable using. The rehabilitation did not provide that frame. What the rehabilitation provided was a different portrait, a different public, in a different period. The portrait served its purpose. It was maintained with the same professional skill that every preceding portrait had been maintained with. The distance between the portrait and what the people inside the household had directly experienced remained exactly what it had always been. The rehabilitation also required something that the portrait operation more generally did not always require: the active participation of the media figures whose coverage had been most damaging to the Charles and Camilla story during the years of the Diana period. The correspondents and columnists and editors who had written about Camilla as the villain of the Wales marriage had to be brought to a different position. The transition from that position to the current one was managed with the patience and the relationship cultivation that the Clarence House apparatus had developed across decades for exactly this kind of operation. Former journalists who went through this process have described it with the specific candor of people whose careers have moved past the point where the candor produces consequences. A former editor at a publication that had been consistently hostile to Camilla during the Diana years described the experience of being brought around to a different position. He said it did not happen through any single conversation or any single briefing. It happened through the accumulated effect of a series of interactions, some of them formal and some of them informal, each of which introduced new information or new framing or new context, and each of which built on the preceding ones in the way that effective persuasion builds on its own accumulation. He said at no point during the process was he conscious of being managed. He said at every point during the process, he was conscious of what was happening and was managing his own response to it with the professional judgment he had developed across his career. He said both sentences are accurate descriptions of the same process, and that the fact that they are both accurate is itself the most useful thing he can say about what the rehabilitation operation was like. From the inside, he said the coverage changed. He said he made editorial judgments as the coverage changed that he believed were the right editorial judgments, given the available information at each specific moment. He said he was not certain those judgments were uninfluenced by the relationship environment in which they were being made. He said he was fairly certain that no editor making judgments in that relationship environment could be certain of that either. Father and sons, he had two sons. William Arthur Philip Louis was born June 21, 1982. Henry Charles Albert David was born September 15, 1984. By the time the younger was born, the marriage that produced both of them was in the process of the slow visible deterioration that the public record from the mid-1980s documents in considerable detail. What the public record does not document comparably is what the deterioration looked like from the children's perspective. These are the accounts with the closest proximity, and they are the accounts the institutional management has worked most carefully to contain. because the children were the heirs to the throne, and their experience of their father's household was information with specific institutional sensitivity. Harry has spoken. The memoir, published in 2023, contains the most direct public account available of what it was like to grow up as the second son of the Prince of Wales. It is one person's experience of a shared reality. The other person has not produced a comparable account. What Harry describes about his father is not a portrait of cruelty in any simple register. The complexity is one of the things that makes it credible. He describes a father who could be warm in specific circumstances, who possessed genuine humor, who was capable of real engagement, in moments when the institutional demands had released enough to allow something natural. He describes those moments as real and as having mattered to him, in the way real things matter to children who are looking for them. He also describes the absences, not primarily the physical absences, though those were real, but the emotional ones. The moments when the children had been in genuine need, and the need had not been met. The specific quality of his father's manner during periods of difficulty. The management, the controlled processing of difficulty through the same mechanism of continuation that the household staff had observed and described. The breakfast that proceeded normally on the morning after a night when the household had been aware of circumstances that were not normal. Harry writes about his mother's death in terms that require careful reading to absorb the specific thing being said about his father's behavior in the immediate aftermath. He does not write about cruelty. He writes about a specific kind of absence. The absence of the full parental presence the situation required, which was not available from the father who remained. He writes about the Balmoral response and what it looked like from inside the building, where two boys were told their mother was dead, and where the institutional response and the personal response of the person responsible for them in that moment were things he was still, at 38, working to integrate. The Balmoral response, in the days after Diana's death in August 1997, became one of the most examined episodes in the modern history of the British monarchy. The decision to remain in Scotland, to keep the boys in Scotland, to maintain the household's routine, while the public expression of grief in London built toward the extraordinary. Scenes of the week that followed has been analyzed across multiple accounts and multiple frameworks. It has been analyzed as a failure of institutional judgment about the public mood. It has been analyzed as a correct instinct about the children's needs to be protected from the spectacle. It has been analyzed as the product of Philip's specific philosophy about how grief should be managed. What Harry's account adds to the existing analyses is the specific subjective experience of the child inside the building. The child who had been told his mother was dead, and who was then in the company of the adult responsible for him, and who found, in the days that followed, that the adult's engagement with his grief was managed in the same way that the adult managed everything that required a departure from the institutional framework, not absent, not hostile, managed. The grief acknowledged in the formal register and then processed through the mechanism of continuation, the mechanism of the maintained schedule, and the maintained requirements, and the maintained performance of the institutional life that the institutional life required. He has described his father in this period as someone who was not able to give him what he needed. He has not described his father as someone who understood what he needed and chose not to give it. The distinction is the one the whole account has been building toward: the inability rather than the choice. The inability that was not a failure of will at any identifiable moment, but the product of a formation that had installed across 7 decades. The specific structure of relating to other people that the household staff and the ladies-in-waiting and the equerry with the backup pen and the former private secretary with his plain English word had all, from their different proximities, been describing. William has said nothing publicly. The calculation required to remain silent about it while his brother has chosen not to is not simple, and the complexity is part of the picture that the institution's management has produced around the relationship between them. The silence has been deployed as evidence of dignified loyalty. The speaking has been deployed as evidence of self-interested grievance. Both deployments serve the institution's interests rather than the honest assessment of what the brothers are doing. What they are both doing, in their different ways and with their different calculations about the cost, is navigating the inheritance their father left them. Not the crown, not the titles, not the material advantages of being born into the most prominent family in the country. The inheritance is the formation, the specific formation that a childhood inside Charles's household, inside the management and the requirements and the rages and the absences, installed in two boys who were watching closely and absorbing everything available to be absorbed. The Sussex departure of January 2020 and the Oprah interview of March 2021 were in retrospect the product of this inheritance being worked out in public. Harry and Meghan had concluded, through the specific calculation people make when they have exhausted the alternatives, that remaining inside the institution as currently constituted was not compatible with their well-being or Meghan's safety. The conclusion produced the institutional response that such conclusions always produce. The management intensified. The delegitimization operation ran with the force that the palace communications apparatus could bring to a target it had been managing with some intensity since the relationship began in 2016. Harry's account of the conversations with his father in the period leading up to the departure is specific, and it is not flattering. He describes a father who was not available in the ways the situation required. He describes conversations that were not conversations in the functional sense of an exchange between two people attempting to reach genuine understanding, but managed communications that kept careful distance from the full weight of what was actually being said. He describes his father as someone who understood the institutional calculus of the situation more readily than the human one. This is consistent with what the household staff described from an earlier period. Charles understood institutions. He moved within them and through them with the competence of someone who had been inside them his entire life and who had absorbed their operating logic, the human calculus, the specific assessments that require taking seriously the emotional reality of the person in front of you rather than the institutional reality of the situation they are creating, was the calculus the formation had never fully developed in him. He managed the Sussex departure through the institutional framework. He processed his younger son's distress through the mechanism of continuation. He attended to the requirements of the situation as an institutional problem requiring institutional management. He did not, by any account from people close to the center during those months, engage with what his son was actually saying, in the register that what his son was saying deserved. The press and the machine, the relationship between Clarence House and the British press, is one that every royal correspondent, who has been inside it long enough to understand it, describes in broadly consistent terms, once they are outside it, and the specific professional dependencies that being inside it created are no longer operational. A former senior royal correspondent who covered Charles for a major broadsheet across an extended period described the operating dynamic with the retrospective candor of someone whose career had taken her past, the point where the candor would produce the professional consequences it would have produced earlier. She said, the Clarence House communications operation was not primarily a reactive operation in the sense of a press office that responds to coverage, was a proactive shaping operation. The distinction was the important one. A reactive press office waits for stories and manages them when they arrive. A shaping operation works continuously on the conditions in which coverage is produced, on the questions journalists decide to pursue, and the sources they decide to consult, and the frames through which they interpret what they find. She said the shaping operated primarily through the cultivation of relationships. The communications professionals at Clarence House understood which editors and correspondents were influential in the production of coverage that mattered, and they invested in those relationships with the patience and consistency of people who understood that relationship cultivation was the primary mechanism of their work. The investment produced the return that relationship investments produce: preferential access, advance notification of stories that could be managed before publication, the small advantages of being inside the information flow that journalists covering an institution need in order to function. She said she had been inside the information flow, and that being inside it had shaped her coverage in ways she had not at the time fully registered, because the shaping was not crude enough to register as shaping. The sympathetic frame was not imposed. It was arrived at through a process that felt like normal journalistic judgment. The access, the briefings, the relationships had accumulated into a set of professional dispositions that made certain stories seem more natural to pursue and certain stories seem less professionally rewarding. The less professionally rewarding stories were the ones about the rages and the requirements and the constitutional overreach and the texture of what the people in his immediate vicinity experienced. She said the first time she fully understood the mechanism was when she produced a piece that Clarence House had not anticipated, and that landed with a directness the relationship management had not produced. The response was not angry and not dramatic. It was the quiet adjustment of the relationship, the access subtly reduced. The advance notifications that were the relationship's practical currency came less frequently. The sense of being inside the circle from which she had been working was gently and professionally withdrawn. The withdrawal had the specific quality of something happening without ever being named, which was the quality that made it completely clear in its effect and completely impossible to formally address. She adjusted, she recalibrated. She produced the kind of coverage that restored the relationship to its functional state. She said this was not a conscious decision to compromise her journalism. It was the accumulated effect of the environment she was working in and the professional dependencies that working in it had created. She said the accumulated effect was not distinguishable from a conscious decision in its outcomes. She left the royal beat after several years. She had never, while covering it, written a piece about the rages or the requirements, or the constitutional correspondence at anything close to the scale or specificity that the evidence available to her would have supported. The evidence had been available to her. The pieces had not been written. The Chelsea Barracks episode of 2009 illustrates the full mechanism in a way that earlier interventions do not, because by 2009, the intervention was documented well enough that coverage of it produced a period of press scrutiny the Clarence House apparatus had to manage in real time. The facts were clear. Charles had written to the Qatari Prime Minister. The letter had achieved its intended effect. The architects whose commission had been ended by the letter had gone on the record. The Guardian had obtained documents through Freedom of Information requests and published reporting that described the mechanism with the clarity documentary evidence provides. What happened next is documented through retrospective accounts of journalists who covered it and through the subsequent investigation by the campaigning group Republic. The Clarence House response was the standard response deployed at higher intensity. The specific message communicated through the relationship channels, not in writing, not in ways that could be documented, but in the currency of the relationship exchanges that were the apparatus's operating medium, was that the Chelsea Barracks story was being framed in a way that mischaracterized what had happened, and that journalists covering it would find their access to the palace's cooperation on future stories affected by the tone of their current coverage. A journalist who covered the story described the experience of navigating the response with the wry honesty of someone now at a position from which the honesty is no longer professionally costly. She said the framing that emerged in most mainstream coverage was the one that characterized the intervention as an architectural controversy with a royal dimension rather than as a constitutional matter with an architectural occasion. The architectural framing placed the question in the domain of aesthetic disagreement, where Charles was a recognized participant with recognized opinions. The constitutional framing placed the question in the domain of democratic accountability, where his participation was formally prohibited. The framing that dominated was the one that served the institutional management. This was not a conspiracy. It was the accumulated effect of professional relationships operating according to their established logic. The logic was not corrupt. It was the ordinary logic of access-dependent journalism functioning within its ordinary constraints. The outcomes it produced were the ones the logic consistently produced. The inner circle and its function. There is a particular kind of person that institutions of this kind produce in abundance, not the principles, not the people at the center whose names are known, the people around the center. The ones whose professional identity is defined by proximity to someone more important than themselves, and whose entire career is built on the maintenance of that proximity and on the specific skills proximity requires. Charles's inner circle across the decades was composed of people of this type. Not exclusively, not without variation. There were individuals within it who brought genuine, independent judgment and professional integrity, and who maintained those qualities in ways that occasionally produced friction. But the gravitational pull of the position was always toward the other type. The type that had refined the skill of telling the person at the center what they wanted to hear into something approaching an art form. A former senior advisor who worked within Charles's household for several years described the dynamic with the precision of someone who had observed it from inside and who had, after leaving, reached the distance necessary to describe what the inside looked like. He said the defining characteristic was not loyalty in the straightforward sense. It was the skill of managing Charles's perception of the world in ways that confirmed his existing understanding while creating the appearance of genuine engagement with alternatives. He said Charles was not a man who was easy to advise honestly, not because he was hostile to honesty in any explicit sense. He would have said, and appeared to believe, that he valued honest counsel, and that the people around him were providing it. What they were providing was something that looked like honest counsel and functioned as validation. The distinction was subtle enough that Charles could not see it from inside it. The people providing it understood the distinction completely. The mechanism was not crude, not simple agreement followed by enthusiastic reinforcement of whatever Charles had already decided. That would have been visible and would not have served the purpose. The mechanism was more sophisticated. It involved genuine engagement with the material, real analysis of real questions, the deployment of actual intelligence, and then the shaping of the output of that genuine engagement toward conclusions that aligned with what Charles had already indicated he wanted to reach, not falsification, emphasis. The selection of which evidence to foreground and which to treat as less significant. This is how you survived as an advisor to someone like Charles. This is what the inner circle learned. The former advisor described a specific type of conversation he had witnessed repeatedly. A conversation about a decision Charles had already made internally before the formal discussion began. A conversation whose function was not to reach a decision, but to produce a record of a decision-making process that would satisfy the requirements of accountability while changing nothing about the decision already reached. He said these conversations had a specific quality you learned to recognize, a particular kind of purposeful energy in the room that was not the energy of genuine inquiry, but the energy of performance. People who understood what the conversation was for and who were performing their roles in it with the professional competence that palace service required. He said Charles performed in these conversations too, not cynically. This is important. He was not a man sitting at the head of the table consciously manufacturing a false process. He was a man who had been told his entire life that his judgment was sound and whose inner circle had been carefully selected for people who confirmed that telling and who had reached a place where the manufactured process felt from the inside like genuine deliberation. He could not see it from inside it. People who challenged the view too directly did not last. People who confirmed it reliably did. The selection produced an inner circle that reflected Charles back to himself in the form he found most comfortable. And Charles, surrounded by this reflection, continued to believe he was seeing the world rather than a mirror. The former advisor described how the selection operated in practice. It was not a conscious hiring policy. No one sat in a room and wrote down the qualities they were looking for in the form that would have made the policy visible. must be capable of shaping analysis toward predetermined conclusions, must be able to perform genuine deliberation, must select evidence with sufficient skill that selection is invisible as selection. No document said that. No conversation said it directly. What the selection process produced instead was the accumulation of small observable outcomes. People who had challenged directly were, over time, less present in the rooms where the important conversations happened. The challenging was not disciplined, not formally sanctioned, not removed from the record in any way that could be identified as the act of management. The challenging simply produced, incrementally and without drama, a reduction in the social and professional capital that being inside the inner circle required. People found themselves briefed later, consulted less, present in the room for the formal parts of the process rather than the informal parts where the real shaping happened. They were not fired, they were marginated. The margination was as complete in its effects as firing would have been and left no comparable record. He said he watched this happen to 2 colleagues before he understood that it was happening as a mechanism rather than as a series of unrelated individual outcomes. By the time he understood it as a mechanism, he had already been in the room for enough conversations to understand what the mechanism was producing and had already said, in enough of those conversations, the things that had reduced the marginated colleagues to their current positions. He said the understanding arrived with a quality he found difficult to describe, not regret, because the alternative was not something he had chosen at any identifiable moment, but something he had been produced into by the accumulated effect of working within the environment. Not anger, because anger would have required identifying a person who had designed the environment intentionally, and the environment was not designed intentionally. It was produced by the operation of a formation that no one in the room had chosen, and that no one in the room fully understood from the inside. What it arrived with, he said, was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally understand the mechanism you have been inside, and that understanding removes the ambiguity that had made remaining inside it feel possible. He said the clarity was cold. He said the cold was useful. He left not long after. He said the leaving was not dramatic. It was the result of having said what needed to be said and watching the saying make no difference enough times that the continuation no longer made sense. He said the professional costs of leaving were real and lasting. He said he would make the same decision again. The specific meeting that produced his departure was not, as it happens, the meeting about the Black Spider correspondence, though that meeting was among the ones that contributed to his decision. It was a meeting about the Black Spider correspondence that produced his final understanding of what the inner circle had become. A Freedom of Information request had been filed. The question in the room was how to respond to the legal obligation to disclose. He said the conversation about how to respond was conducted with the same mechanism he had been describing. Analysis presented, conclusion shaped toward the preferred outcome, which was that disclosure should be resisted through every available legal avenue. He spoke. He said what the honest assessment of the legal position and the constitutional implications required him to say. The speaking was received in the cold register. He noted his dissent for the record, which was the phrase the inner circle had developed for saying something once that contradicted the preferred conclusion and not insisting upon it further. The noting of dissent for the record was what happened. The correspondence continued to be resisted through every available legal avenue, as it had been before he spoke. He left not long after that meeting. He said the meeting was not what ended it. The meeting was the meeting in which the ending became legible. He also said something else, which his former colleague has described since. He said that after enough years of distance from the role, the formal vocabulary he had used within it began to feel like a language he had spoken for a long time in a place where no other language was available. And that when he encountered people who spoke the plain language, people who had not spent their professional lives inside the management, he felt the gap between the two languages with a specific physical quality, the way a returned traveler feels the gap between the country they came back from and the country they came back to. He said the plain language was not unkind. He said the plain language was accurate. The women in the rooms, there is a dimension of the Charles story that the standard account tends to pass through without stopping. Not Camilla, not Diana, not the women whose names are part of the main narrative, and whose experiences have been documented and analyzed across decades. The other women. The women who worked in his households as secretaries and housekeepers and ladies-in-waiting and personal assistants, and the various categories of female professional and domestic service that surrounded him throughout his adult life. These women experienced something specific, something that was its own category within the broader experience of serving Charles, and that requires its own account because the broader account loses something that matters when it absorbs it as just another feature of the household. What they experienced was a particular kind of invisibility, not the invisibility of the staff generally, though they experienced that too. A gendered invisibility, the specific invisibility of women in service to a man of his generation and formation and position who had been shaped by institutions and traditions that treated women in professional roles as a category of presence, whose function was support and whose personhood was not the primary concern of the person being supported. A former personal secretary described her experience of working for Charles with the specific clarity of someone who has had considerable time to understand what her experience contained and who has decided that the understanding deserves to be said. She said Charles was not hostile to women in any explicit sense. He was not the type to make statements that constitute the formal category of workplace hostility. He did not create a working environment that was hostile in the identifiable ways that formal accountability mechanisms address. What he created was something subtler. The working environment of a man for whom women in professional roles were a category of presence whose primary function was to support his operation, and whose independent professional identity was not something the environment was structured to accommodate. She described the specific experience of having a professional judgment dismissed, not loudly, not with any explicit statement that the judgment was being dismissed because it came from her. With the subtler mechanism of simply not registering, the opinion offered and not received, not challenged, which would at least have acknowledged its existence, not engaged with, which would have required treating it as something worth engaging with. Simply passed over, moved past as if it had not been offered. She said this happened with a consistency that established it as the environment's normal operating register rather than an isolated incident. And she said that its consistency was what made it most difficult to address, because addressing it required identifying a pattern rather than a specific event. Patterns of the kind she was describing do not produce the kind of concrete accountable incident that formal processes exist to address. She said she watched the same pattern operate differently with the male members of the professional staff. Not uniformly, not without variation. There were men whose judgments were also routinely passed over, and women whose contributions were occasionally registered with genuine engagement. But the pattern in the aggregate produced a working environment in which the professional authority of women was a different thing from the professional authority of men, and the difference was felt by every woman in the household with the accuracy of something directly experienced. A former housekeeper described a different dimension, the physical dimension. The daily management of Charles's physical environment that was the primary work of the female domestic staff, and that was, in the experience of the women who performed it, work that was invisible in the specific sense that it disappeared upon completion. She said there is a particular experience that is common to people whose professional labor makes other people's lives comfortable and orderly, and who perform that labor inside an environment where the comfort and order produced are understood by the person who benefits from them as the natural state of things rather than as the product of someone's work. She said the experience is not unique to working for Charles. She said it was more total in his case than in any other professional environment she had worked in, because the degree to which he experienced the environment around him as simply the way the environment was with no working connection between the environment and the labor that maintained it, was more complete than she had encountered elsewhere. She said Charles walked through rooms that were ready and experienced rooms that were ready. The rooms being ready was the normal state of rooms. The women who had prepared the rooms were the apparatus by which the normal state was maintained, not people with their own professional investment in the maintenance. A former lady-in-waiting described the most formal dimension of the same reality. She said Charles performed the correct register of courtesy toward women of appropriate social standing. He was not rude in the formal sense. He was not dismissive in any way that a social account of the encounter would record as dismissive. What he was, she said, was correct. Specifically and carefully correct, in the way that people are correct when correctness is the full extent of what they owe the person they are being correct with. She said she had spent considerable time trying to identify whether underneath the correctness there was anything else, any residue of genuine interest or attention or concern, and that the most honest answer she could produce was that she had not been able to find it. She said the formal social surface was entirely intact. She said underneath the formal social surface, there was nothing that required acknowledgement. She also made an observation that she said she had never shared in any public account, and that she shared with the specific deliberateness of someone who has decided the thing is worth saying once and on the record. She said she had, over many years, compared notes in the informal way that people who have served in similar positions compare notes with other women who had worked in comparable households across the extended royal and aristocratic professional world that the British class system produces. She said the pattern she had observed in Charles's household was not unique in its components. It was the intensity of the pattern that distinguished it, the specific totality of it. The degree to which the formal surface with nothing behind it was the complete picture rather than a partial one. She said she had worked for men who were more warmly present than Charles, and for men who were less warmly present. She had not worked for a man for whom the formal surface was so completely the whole of it, the entire account of what was available, with nothing remaining for discovery underneath. She said this was the thing about him that she found, at the greatest distance, most difficult to characterize without reaching for the vocabulary that the formal register had been developed to avoid. The formal register was there for a reason. It was there because accuracy about a person of his position and power required management. It was there because the accurate characterization, the plain English characterization, had professional costs that made its use inside the professional relationship impossible. The former private secretary had used the plain word, a private secretary, years after the professional relationship had ended, in the specific conditions that made the plain word finally usable. The former lady-in-waiting said something similar in different terms. She said there is a point at which continued resort to the formal vocabulary begins to feel like a form of complicity with the thing you are trying to describe. She said that point was not a line she had crossed while she was employed. She had used the formal vocabulary because the formal vocabulary was required. She said she had crossed the line some years after the employment ended, when a former colleague had asked her what working for him had actually been like, and she had found herself, for the first time, reaching for the plain language. She said she understood in that moment what the plain language was for, and why the formal vocabulary had been developed to displace it. The formal vocabulary was for the institution. The plain language was for the person who had worked within the institution and who had found at sufficient distance that the truth about their experience deserved a more accurate account than the institution's vocabulary was designed to provide. The king he became king on September 8, 2022, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, in the presence of a small number of senior royal household members and the Prime Minister, who was herself in the building. For only the second day, a tenure that would prove short. The world learned of his mother's death through the BBC's broadcasting of the bulletin in the late afternoon and learned within minutes who the new king was, though everyone had always known. The official portrait was updated with the efficiency that had always characterized the portrait management. The sensitive, misunderstood prince became the mature monarch. The years of waiting became preparation. The architectural campaigns became prescience. The environmental advocacy became vindication. The communications apparatus pivoted as it had always pivoted. The senior advisors who made the transition with him describe what they have publicly called a period of adjustment, in the careful language of people, describing something they are still professionally proximate to and for whom the formal vocabulary is still the available one. They say the transition has involved changes in how certain things are managed. They say this with the specific quality of language that is accurate as far as it goes, and that is selected precisely because it does not go further. What the transition has not involved, by any account from anyone who has been inside it, is any substantive revision of the formation. The man who became King Charles III on September 8, 2022, had been formed across 73 years. The people who serve him as king are serving the same formation in a different role. The requirements are the requirements. The cold register is the cold register. The household operates on the terms the household has always operated on. The transition from heir to monarch changed the constitutional dimension of the problem in ways that the observers of that dimension have noted with varying degrees of directness. The Black Spider memos were the letters of a Prince of Wales operating outside his constitutional lane. The equivalent communications from a sitting monarch are the communications of a king, with executive access to ministers that no heir to the throne formally possesses. The constitutional question that the letters raised, whether and how the monarch's personal views were influencing the operation of elected government, was a question that could be managed by the communications apparatus when the actor was a prince. It is a question with more material weight when the actor is the king. There has been no equivalent of the Black Spider memo's disclosure for King Charles III. There has been no Freedom of Information Act case requiring a Supreme Court judgment to produce a disclosure of letters written by the king to sitting ministers. The absence of such a disclosure is not equivalent to the absence of such letters. It is simply the absence of a successful Freedom of Information case. There are also new staff. Not entirely new and not new at every level, but new in several positions that his accession required to be filled differently. These people have been observed in their work by the journalists and the constitutional scholars, and the former household members who observe these things professionally. The descriptions that emerge from these observers have the specific quality of descriptions produced through the formal vocabulary rather than the plain one. The new staff are described as managing the transition effectively, managing the demands of the new role, navigating the requirements of the expanded institutional responsibilities. The vocabulary is the vocabulary. It is doing what it does. The staff who serve the king as king are learning what the staff who serve the prince as prince learned across their own tenures. They are learning the requirements, and they are learning the consequences of the requirements failing, and they are carrying backup pens or their contemporary equivalent, and they are learning to receive the cold register with the specific physical posture of people who have learned to occupy the space of being corrected without the occupation being visible as discomfort. Some of them will stay for a long time. Some of them will leave sooner. The ones who leave will take with them the knowledge that the people who leave always take. At some point, at the sufficient distance that the conditions for plain language require, some of them will have a conversation. And the conversation will produce, as the conversation between the former private secretary and his colleague produced the word. The same word, or a word of the same plain kind. The word that does not require diplomatic management. The word that means exactly what it says. The former private secretary, who spoke his plain English word, had spoken it years before the accession. He had spoken it about the Prince of Wales. He would not have spoken it differently about the king. The formation that the word was for does not change its nature because the person it inhabits changes his title. What the word was for charitable work is not a defense. This requires saying at the end of an account that has described the damage of a life, because the account is incomplete without the acknowledgement. that the life also produced genuine public good that existed alongside the damage. The Prince's Trust has now operated for nearly 50 years. It has served hundreds of thousands of young people who were not in education or employment or training and who found in the Trust's practical interventions a route to outcomes they would not otherwise have reached. The people it served were real. The outcomes were real. The organic farming operation at Highgrove preceded the mainstream environmental turn by many years. The argument he was making in the 1980s about industrial agriculture, about the relationship between soil health and human health, about the long-term consequences of farming practices that were then standard, has aged better than the mainstream dismissals of it. The architectural argument, stripped of its specific interventions and its constitutional overreach, contained a genuine philosophical position about the relationship between the built environment and human well-being that deserved to be assessed on its own terms. Some of its prescriptions, including the emphasis on human scale and the critique of mid-century urban planning, were prescriptions that subsequent design thinking has validated in various forms. These were real things. The portrait was built on real material. The problem was not the material. The problem was the arrangement of the light. There is a question underneath everything this account has described that has not yet been directly addressed. How does a person become the specific thing that Charles became? How does a human being arrive at the particular configuration of entitlement and coldness and constitutional certainty and the specific quality of relationship to the people around him that the staff described, the courtiers managed, and the institution buried? It does not happen in adulthood. It does not happen at any specific identifiable point that could be addressed. It happens in childhood, in the specific daily accumulated experience of growing up inside a system that tells you through every mechanism available to it that you are different, that the normal rules of human interaction do not apply to you fully, that your needs and your preferences and your reactions are more important than the needs and preferences and reactions of the people around you, not because you have earned that importance, but because you were born into it. Charles was born into it on November 14, 1948. From that moment, the entire apparatus of the British monarchy was oriented around him in ways that expressed in every daily interaction the singular importance of his existence. This is not a criticism of his parents specifically. It is a description of a system that has been producing people like Charles for centuries, because the production is what the system is designed to do. The heir to the throne must believe in the importance of the throne and in his own fitness to occupy it. An institution that depends for its survival on the continuation of the hereditary principle cannot afford an heir who is uncertain about the fundamental legitimacy of what he represents. So the certainty is produced through every mechanism available. A child told consistently and comprehensively from birth that they are different and that the world is organized around them does not become a balanced adult. They become the adult Charles became, capable of the genuine qualities the formation also produces and also shaped at the level of basic assumption about how the world works and what it owes them in ways that no amount of subsequent education or self-awareness is going to fully reach, because the assumption is not conscious. The assumption was installed before he had the cognitive capacity to evaluate it and runs underneath every subsequent experience. The Queen and Philip were not cruel parents in any simple sense. They were the products of their own formations. Philip was shaped by a wartime naval career and a displaced European childhood that had its own particular costs. Elizabeth was shaped by the weight of a crown she had not sought, and the understanding that the crown's requirements superseded everything, including the requirements of her children. They were not warm parents. The primary relationship was with the institution. The demands the institution made left limited residue for the kind of consistent, present, emotionally attuned parenting that produces children who grow up with a secure and balanced sense of themselves. Charles was sent to boarding school at 8. The tradition was followed without apparent consideration of whether the tradition served the child. He was sensitive, and he was placed in an environment that had no use for sensitivity and treated it as a weakness to be overcome. He was bullied. He wrote to his parents. His parents replied that he must keep his chin up. He learned to stop showing the need. The need did not disappear. It relocated. A direct line runs from the child who learned at Gordonstown that his suffering would not be attended to by the people with the power to attend to it to the adult who did not attend to the suffering of the people around him. The child who learned that endurance was the required response became the adult whose emotional vocabulary did not contain the responses that other people's endurance required. The morning after the difficult night at Kensington Palace. The breakfast that proceeded as scheduled. The request for more tea. The armor that the formations installed is not selective. It does not protect you from the people whose suffering you choose to ignore, while leaving you open to genuine connection with the people you choose to attend to. It operates comprehensively. It keeps everything at the managed distance the formation required. The man who became king after 73 years of waiting, who had devoted decades to causes he genuinely believed in, and who had suffered genuine costs in his personal life. That man was also someone the system had prevented from being fully present to the people around him, from being available, from being capable of the unrehearsed human responses that the people around him needed and that the system had ensured he would never fully develop. Understanding this does not require forgiving the consequences for the people who served him, for Diana, for the constitutional health of the institution he now leads, are real regardless of the explanation for how he became what he became. Explanation is not exoneration. Understanding the formation does not show the record of the behavior, but it changes the nature of the account. It moves it from the territory of the simple villain portrait, which is as reductive as the official one, into the territory of the complicated human truth. People are produced by specific systems and specific experiences. The production has costs for everyone inside it, including the person produced. The system is also still running. This is what the standard account, in its concentration on Charles specifically, tends to occlude. Charles is one person. The system that produced him is not one person and has not stopped operating. The heir to the throne, William, was produced by a variant of the same system, with the additional formation of a childhood. Inside Charles's household during its most acutely difficult period, his children are now in the early stages of their own production. The system continues. The formation continues. The people the system is currently producing will, at some point in their adult lives, have their own conversations. Their own colleagues will describe, in the careful general terms of someone who understands what they are saying and what it costs, the conversations in which the formal vocabulary was finally set down. The record the present generation of former staff is beginning to build, in the fragments of testimony that the distance and the dissolved professional dependencies and the accumulated weight of the carrying have produced, is a record of a system rather than of a single person who happened to be its current most visible product. The record is incomplete. It will remain incomplete for a long time. The full account of what it is like to be inside the machinery that produces the British monarchy from the inside, with no access to the official portrait and full access to the daily reality, is not something the system has any interest in facilitating, and is not something that the formal vocabulary, the vocabulary of difficult and challenging and particular and demanding, was designed to produce. The plain language is producing it, slowly, in fragments, in the private conversations that acquire public forms as the distance from the institution grows, and the conditions for the plain language stabilize. The record is assembling. It has been assembling for long enough to be readable now, not in its complete form, in the outline form that fragments of sufficient accumulation produce. The outline of a man formed by a specific system to be a specific kind of person, capable of genuine things and damaged in specific ways, who occupied the most prominent position in the country for the full span of his adult life, and who treated the people around him according to a formation that the system had installed before he was old enough to assess it. There is a particular quality to the moment when a buried account reaches sufficient accumulation that the burial becomes unsustainable. It does not arrive as a single revelation. It does not produce a clean break, the way the public imagines it must, the way the dramatic logic of exposure narratives requires. What it produces instead is a perceptible shift in the weight of the evidence, a point at which the people who have been managing the gap between the official account and the actual one find that the gap has grown to a size that the management no longer fully covers. That point is not a moment. It is a condition that develops over time and that becomes visible only in retrospect. The condition has been developing around the account of Charles for long enough, now that it is beginning to be visible, not fully, not in the form that will eventually exist when the full archival record is available, and the people still inside the formal vocabulary have either left the household or left the world, and the conditions for the plain language are no longer only available in private rooms, but enough that the former senior private secretary and his colleague were not wrong about what they were doing when they sat in a room together at sufficient distance and used the plain English word. They were not saying something that the people around Charles had not already said to themselves. They were saying something that the record was in the process of supporting. They were ahead of the official account, as the people with direct experience are always ahead of the official account, and behind the full account, as everyone always is, and exactly where the record needed them to be. For the fragment they were contributing to have the weight it needed. The word landed with the weight of something carried for a long time. It was the weight of the backup pens and the bath temperatures and the boiled eggs and the cold register in the garden and the note of dissent for the record and the morning after the difficult night and the request for more tea. It was the weight of the women whose opinions were passed over and the architects whose commissions were ended and the civil servants who found no good options in their mail. It was the weight of the children carrying the inheritance. It was accurate. It was short. It required no diplomatic management. It meant exactly what it said. The former senior private secretary and his colleague were in a room together, years after the service had ended, and the distance from it was sufficient that the formal vocabulary was no longer the only vocabulary available. The distance from a thing is the condition that makes the plain language possible. The formal vocabulary is not dishonesty. It is the language of people still inside an institution, still dependent on their proximity to it, still required to manage the gap between what they know and what the outside world is told. It is the functional language of the household. You speak it because the household requires it, and because the household has provided the context in which everything else in your professional life has meaning. When the context dissolves, the requirement dissolves. When the requirement dissolves, the plain language arrives, not to expose, not to damage, not out of grievance or bitterness, or the specific vindictive pleasure that people who have not been inside the institution imagine is motivating the people who eventually speak, out of the simple and specific relief of being able to say accurately what a thing was, having spent years saying around it. The word was accurate, it was short, it required no diplomatic management. It meant exactly what it said. The colleague understood immediately, because the colleague had been there, and the colleague knew what the word was for. You know what the word is for too. Now, you have read what it was for. You have read the bath temperature and the backup pen and the boiled eggs and the cold register and the letter to the Qatari Prime Minister and the morning after Diana's night and the request for more tea and the notes of dissent that changed nothing and the women in the rooms whose judgments were passed over and the children carrying the inheritance and the inner circle reflecting the man back to himself in the form he found most comfortable. You know what the word was for. The word was accurate. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.